computer. Oh, welcome back to the Krishnacore Chronicles. We've had a few years silent, but I'm pleased to say that we're back for podcast number 25. And I'm joined by the founder of Krishnacore.com, and also the Sounds of Liberation Facebook group, who he works with alongside Mardu, who's my previous co-host. The fantastic, the incredible Mark Langstone. It's great to see you, Mark, and you're
Hey,
joining us from Australia, aren't you?
yeah, I'm in Sydney.
So could you just begin just by kind of introducing yourself and telling the listeners who you are and a little bit of background about yourself?
Yeah, I was born in UK in 1973, and I came over to Australia in 1997. So my legal name is Mark Langstone. So people call me Mark, or people call me VJ. My spiritual name is VJ Goranga Das, but it's a bit of a handful for people. So yeah, it normally gets shortened. People that know me in the temple, VJ or Mark. But yeah, I came over to Australia in 1997, and shortly after got involved in the temple here in about 1998. But yeah, I guess we'll backtrack to like how I came to start off in the punk scene when I was like probably about 15.
Okay.
Uh, from metal. We was all at school, we were all like metalheads at age sort of 14, 15, and that kind of transition over into sort of thrash and grindcore, which was pretty big in the UK. And yeah, bands like Napalm Death were very influential on me in terms of like, turning vegetarian, as well as like Youth of Today in the American scene. And yeah, so gradually like we went from sort of metal to kind of grind and all that. And yeah, and into sort of different kind of like hardcore melodic kind of stuff. And yeah, and then pretty soon straight edge, so Youth of Today were, pretty prominent then, and like Gorilla Biscuits and things like that. I always regret, two of my friends went to see Gorilla Biscuits, and it meant sleeping on someone's couch. So I was like, I'll skip that. I'll see him next time. Next time was about 25 years later. Actually, in Australia, I saw him. Yeah. But yeah, they were massive influence, bands like that. So I always had kind of quite a diverse taste in music. And then, we'll probably talk later if we get more time on the sort of reggae influence as well. But yeah, it was like, I think like kind of hardcore punk for me was probably the most like influential, on my kind of thinking and even just the style of music. And then, of course, like, like Ray Kappa was like God to us. Like when we were young, he was almost like larger than life, he was almost like a figure that you just, couldn't even ever imagine meeting. Of course, that was just a sort of funny, childish kind of way of thinking. But, later on you get to meet these personalities and, they're quite down to earth. But anyway, we kind of hung on almost every word of some of these people, and Ian Mackay and people like that. Yeah, when the Youth Today kind of wound up, um, it was sad. I actually missed them as well. We were going to go see them in 1989, and I think it was the last show of the tour. He told me it was an amazing show. It was in Liverpool in the UK at Planet X. If you've been to Planet X, you can barely move. It's like being in a sewer, and there's so many bands there. But yeah, somehow or other, we couldn't get home. We would have been going back to Manchester, sleep on the station. And like most of us were, oh yeah, we'll do that. Doesn't matter. Sort of would have been pretty dangerous. And so yeah, one of our friends' girlfriends talked us out of it. So yeah, we missed them at the time. But yeah, long story short, basically when he started Shelter, um, I'd read that Maximum Rock and Roll.
Okay.
That was like June 1989, I think, wasn't it? So it was that
Yeah.
summer here. I mean, it was summer in the UK. Um, I always buy Maximum Rock and Roll. I've been reading it for like probably a year or two or something. I really liked it. So when he was on the cover, they did that funny cover where there's like about five of him. It looked like he was kind of like expanding, or I don't know. I don't know if they were trying to take the piss out of him or.
Mm.
But yeah, that interview, they were trying to sort of pull him apart. But I actually came out of that interview like quite fascinated. And when he was talking about going to a temple, I just imagined like the temple was like somewhere in the wilderness, and you sort of going up some kind of, I don't know, mystical sort of thing. But
Yeah.
of course it was just like middle of New York. But But
So
anyway, yeah, the kind of philosophy kind of fascinated me.
yeah,
And yeah, hadn't really read anything quite like I'd seen Hare Krishnas in the street. Actually, just prior to that, maybe a couple of years, we'd seen them. We'd stepped back. I didn't really think anything bad about them, but I just thought, well, that's different. And I used to sort of follow them and just think, I used to think, like, what do they do? Like when they finish that, what's their life like? Or something. But and then I actually met a couple in the street, and I took a small book off one, and he asked for a donation. I was going to give it to some homeless people, but I didn't find any homeless people that
mm,
day. So, kind of like prophetically, this guy stopped me and gave me a pamphlet and asked for £2. And I was like, oh, that seems a bit pricey, but I gave it. And I said, oh, you
yeah,
guys are vegetarian, aren't you? And I thought we were going to have a rapport. And he kind of like quite bluntly said, yeah, yeah, we are, but that's not the point. You're not this body. And it kind of jarred. I think it was the last thing he said to me and sort of sent me on my way. And I still remember, like, it was, it was a little bit blunt, but I was thinking, that's really interesting. You're not this body. And I was really thinking about that quite a bit. It didn't give me much more information. But of course, when I read that book, it was the Krishna Reservoir of Pleasure. And so that was really interesting. I can't quite remember if I got that. I think I'd already read the Maximum Rock and Roll interview, so I had a very slight introduction to what it was about.
okay,
And then that book was kind of like one of the first Prabhupada book I'd got, and yeah, and I think that it would have been 1989 Maximum Rock and Roll, and then 1990 that first Shelter album came out, The Perfection of Desire, like with the Madhvacharya cover. It was like there with the two
mm,
fingers, and like,
yeah,
and that was fascinating. My friend bought it. I usually bought most of the records, but somehow my friend Matt bought that, and we just tape. Back in that day, you'd get the vinyl, and then you'd put it on tape. And so I remember recording it, and I was playing it in my mum's kitchen. And I can still remember to this day, like the song and the title and the idea of like society based on bodies. And I was like, whoa, that's just so profound. Like, it almost answers everything. The society's based on bodies. And so, like, it's like everything we're sort of doing is kind of wrong. It's like 1 + 1 is 3. And then, you expand that, everything's wrong. So that was really profound. And also the book, that Reservoir Pleasure, I probably read it 2 or 3 times maybe. And
okay,
I was sort of like, right, this is it. This is what I'm going to do. But I was like, yeah, but how? How to do that? Like, I didn't even really know where that temple was. And I think we had an invite once to a temple, but it all seemed a bit daunting, just to
mm.
sort of make your own way. And it was in Whalley Range in Manchester. If you know that
Yeah, I
area,
know, yeah,
Whalley Range. Yeah, later
yeah,
I
yeah.
went to that
I've been to
temple
that
later.
temple. Yeah,
Oh, you've been to that?
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
I only went there once, and actually I called up, and they were a bit funny. Some Indians sort of answered the phone; they weren't very welcoming. But I found my way there, and I found this guy. Actually, reminds me a bit like you. Is this dreaded sort of guy? I don't know if you ever met him, but yeah, I really related to him. And he was sort of saying, like, this Christian consciousness is not a cheap thing. It's like a real jewel. And I
Yeah,
really connected with him. And there's one other devotee that was kind of running the place, but that was much later. That was sort of 15 years ago. But at the time, hadn't gone. But a friend of mine, Jack, who was like a straight edge guy from Stockport, and he was like maybe a few years older than us, so we kind of looked up to him a lot as well. And he found like the scene in Stockport and Manchester, it was all crusty punks, and like nothing wrong with that, but he found that they were quite a bit narrow minded. He didn't relate to them, and somehow,
okay,
oh
yeah,
yeah, that was it. We met him one day in Manchester. My friend Matthias, we always come in to like start skating. Um, and then there was Eastern Bloc Records, which is still there, but it's moved. But Eastern Bloc then was like much more into like kind of, he had a lot of punk and things like that. And I remember seeing this guy Jack, and I could tell he was a straight edger, and I was kind of, he was too shy to talk to him. But later on that day, we were skating down Oxford Street, and my friend Matthias had met him also, and he brought him along, because it kind of went hand in hand, skateboarding and like the punk and hardcore. So then he came along and he kind of hanging out with us, like, and we were all from Buxton, a few of us, and then he started visiting Buxton, like, coming on the train, and he found the scene in Buxton was like more inspiring for him than that. And that band, Matthias had a band called Fallen Pieces. There was him, and there was 80, and I think 80's probably still straight edge, pretty close. Jack's still straight edge. So anyway, Jack was the one. He had actually been to the temple sometimes, and like he actually gave me a couple of books. If anyone else had given me the books, I might have just sort of thought,
okay,
oh,
yeah,
just disregard these. But like whatever he gave me, I thought, well, this must have some value. So I remember he gave me a book called Life Comes from Life. Have you ever seen that one?
Yeah, yeah. I think it's
Yeah.
behind me here
Oh,
somewhere.
it's there.
Yeah,
Wow. One day I'd love to see your collection. There's probably a lot more
yeah.
than I've got. But yeah, the cover kind of put me off. Like religion, like one of your questions was going to be like, did I grow up religious? And I was like absolutely not. I didn't like it. I didn't really want a bar of it. You know, we had all the
Okay.
dogma sort of thing, people knocking on doors. My dad used to invite like the Jehovah's Witnesses in, and I think he's trying to pull apart their philosophy, and I think he'd bore them to death or whatever, and they'd leave. I, I found it all really dogmatic. You know, you get pamphlets saying like, you know, you're all burning in hell, and for me it was just like, you know, it's school and everything. So my parents weren't really religious. They might send us to church, you know, to get us out of the way, and you know, you go to odd weddings, but it was only my gran who was a bit Christian.
Okay.
For me, I'd sort of rejected it wholesale, or I'd become like agnostic. I wouldn't say I was like atheistic. I was very much like gnostic. You know, I used to look at the sky and think, yeah, there's maybe some force that's here, but like, you know, in terms of a God, I was kind of like, no, I wasn't thinking like that. But yeah, these books, life comes from life. I was in a relationship and it's kind of breaking down, and I just turned to start reading that book, and you know, I was like, I just had my head in that book, and it was like, wow, it's all about like, you know, the like kind of theory of evolution versus sort of the Vedic, and I don't know, it kind of flew in the face of what I was taught at school. I kind of liked
Yeah.
anything like that. So yeah, I really had my head in that book, and I was kind of even like ignoring the relationship, you know, because I was just completely absorbed in it. And so it was really those two books I pretty much read. And then he gave me that book's called Prabhupada, and it's kind of the biography, very condensed, small, and he
Yeah.
had a really beat up copy. And so Jack gave me that, and it was yeah, it was on the back of my car. I was driving around, and I was like, "Oh, I'll get around to reading it." I didn't get around to reading it until later on, and then I'd already planned like a trip, like it was kind of around the world ticket, you know. And Australia was sort of in the middle, and then you know the idea was to go US and sort of back. But I started getting really scared and really daunted. I didn't really want to go around the world and back. It's just kind of quite scary to go back to like, you know, just like I had gone back to living in Buxton, you know, after a couple of years in Manchester. But I had a place I was kind of, oh my God, I didn't really want to go around the world and come back again. So somehow or other, I ended up sort of like halfway around and then stayed here. But
That's
yeah, and
that's
I
yeah,
was still involved in the punk scene,
yeah.
like in
I mean,
Australia.
there's so much to unpack there. I mean,
Mm,
Manchester is in the northwest of England for those kind of international listeners, and it's always been a big kind of punk scene there from the mid 70s onwards, from the likes of the got the Buzzcocks and Joy Division, etc. And it still remains today, a major scene um, for music in England, which is a bit different from Buxton, that where you're talking about. Um,
mm,
so you know, so you mentioned Napalm Death as well. So Napalm Death is
mm,
that kind of a narco kind of
mm,
grindcore kind of crusty, like me, like you really. I mean, I listen to Napalm Death and Extreme Noise Terror, and these guys kind of pushed me onto the path of vegetarianism, and it
mm.
was really Extreme Noise Terror's Murder,
Yeah.
and also Conflict as well. Those two
Yeah.
kind of bands really. So were you? So you got into punk at an early age, and then
Mm.
did you then shift into straight edge? And were you straight edge before you met those Krishners, for instance?
Yeah, exactly. It's so funny, like, you know, like it's so parallel, kind of our lives. You know, when you mention those three bands, like I was going to mention three bands like that, they'd probably be the same three bands. Like I went, actually, Napalm Death, I would say that was the first kind of punk or grindcore gig I've been to. The only other gigs I've been to were a couple of metal ones. We saw Slayer and Nuclear Assault, and we saw
Ooh,
Oh yeah, I mean,
yeah,
that was
fantastic.
'88.
Yeah, Slayer.
Yeah,
Whoa.
yeah, incredible. You know, so at school we had nothing. You know, we had no idea what was that. Your head banging. I remember 3 days after that, your ears are still ringing. You know, you're only like we were 15, I think we were.
Yeah,
So,
I was like that when I saw Motorhead. I was about that kind of, you know. So
yeah,
yeah, go on. So you were kind of 15. So you kind of
too
going to
loud.
these.
Like yeah, you know, your neck's hurting, your ears are ringing, and like yeah, but it's just fascinating. And so anyway, Napalm Death. I remember it was like It was nine. It would have been 1989. The sort of summer. It was one of the best times of my life. I'd just finished school and I was about to start like art college. So, that
Okay.
summer, summer seems to last forever when you're a kid, like 6, 7 weeks, whatever. And Napalm Death were playing, and it was a matinee. That wasn't really a thing much in the UK. Like I think
All right.
American matinee, don't they? Like probably CBGBs but Napalm Death were going to play at I forgot the venue. It might come to him in a minute. But it was supposed to be like 2 p.m. So like I was like in the record shop there, and I was like I head down there, like skate down or wherever, and it was it was just in a pub, and they were setting up, but it took ages to set up. I remember waiting for like it was like 2 or 3 hours of just hovering around and waiting. But yeah, the anticipation was kind of like the build
Mm.
up, and then I was standing next to the stacks on the side of the stage, and the stacks were wobbling around like they were about to fall at any moment. So it was absolutely epic. And the SOB was supporting them, and they were like the
Ah,
jazz version. You must have heard them, right? I
yeah,
have this
yeah.
my mate still got it. My mate Adam, and I think he traded that shirt off me for something stupid. He got the better deal because
Mm.
like Napalm Death slash SOB like kind of t-shirt. But that was just like epic for me. That gig like, and it was only me that went. I took like, my own prerogative, and I was kind of leading the people in Buxton. Like I think it was kind of me that got into the metal and the grindcore and then the punk.
Yeah.
So, not to inflate my ego too much, but
Mm.
yeah, I don't know. I was kind of digging for answers really. And yeah, I don't know, I was sharing with people and a lot of people were following and then everyone else kind of got on board. And then I saw Extreme Noise Terror, you just mentioned, because it was like murder. It was like 450 billion animals are murdered in Britain
Mm.
every year, to be shoved down your throat and shot out your ass.
Yeah.
It's senseless murder on it. Like, I could still remember that whole thing. And actually, it was at my 18th birthday. 16 before. So yeah, I think seeing Extreme Noise Terror was slightly later. But I'd seen Napalm Death twice actually. They played again. They played with Carcass and Morbid Angel and Bolt Thrower and Napalm Death. Like an epic. That was at like the University of Manchester, and I had to find my own way there. And um, vegetarianism, like, and all sorts of other ideas, but vegetarianism was pretty key theme in all of them, because everyone wants to sort of change themselves, change the world. It was one of the first things to do was just make total sense to me. It just seems to be nonsense to like eat meat, and it's the only thing that I've never really been attracted to. Other principles are very difficult to follow sometimes, but yeah, for me, meat eating is. I was never really attracted to it anyway. So from that point on, I've been vegetarian. And I noticed my thoughts just became clearer. It just
Yeah.
has an effect on it. Yeah, it's almost like an essential kind of foundation, and then from there you take other steps. So yeah, and conflict. I saw conflict a little bit later. I'd love to have seen it at the time, but again, like it was one of those bands that were hugely influential, and amongst others. But yeah, it's a lot to unpack, a long story. But yeah, in short, basically, those sort of bands were kind of vegetarian, and then it was branching out to like American hardcore. So it was Youth of Today, and they were also vegetarian, but then they were talking about the straight edge. So obviously Minor Threat had the straight edge
Yeah.
song, but it wasn't. For them it wasn't so much starting kind of a movement. But really Ray Capo, Ragnar ran with that idea of sort of straight edge, and then like Gorilla Biscuits, a lot of that kind of thing. It's sort of like 1989, 1990. Yeah, it's just such a buzz with all those sort of things. We drove all the way to try and see Civ once, which came after Gorilla Biscuits, and like I think it
Yeah.
was in Leeds, which is a long way from Buxton, and it was sold out. And like pre-internet days, you had no idea of like checking. So like we were pretty miffed to go all that way and back again. But that was our life. Yeah, like skateboarding, punk rock, going to shows like that, and you know, doing art college, not probably doing much. Just I used to play some of these things, and some of the harder stuff people didn't like, but you could get away with like the early Green Day. We also saw Green Day in the Millstone in I think that was 1990, 91, like in a pub. There was like 40, 50 people, so you could
Yeah.
get away with that at college. The first couple of Green Day albums, and like obviously like Nirvana people would always shout to me to put that on, and sometimes I put some more harder stuff on. I actually remember playing Culture Shock there, And there was a girl at college, and she had like everything written. You know, you write everything like on your satchel or your pencil case. And I remember starting the course, and she had like Culture Shock and these bands written on there. And like I was like, whoa, there's like a girl into all this, and I was terrified to even talk to her. My friend ended dating her, but yeah, that was really big. All those sort of, because that was sort of in a way a bit of reggae coming in, wasn't it? Like it was
Yeah,
kind of ska, and that was amazing.
exactly. Yeah, yeah. And so you were. So let's just kind of go back a bit then. So you were around kind of 16 when 15 when you were listening to Napalm Death.
Yeah.
And then a little bit later, a couple of years later, you kind of found Youth of Today and Gorilla Biscuits and American Hardcore. So
Mm.
when was it that you first came in contact with a devotee? When was it that you mentioned about like like me and like many others, um, uh, the first time I ever came in contact with devotee was in Portsmouth, UK, High Street. And they were handing out these little books that are behind me, these little books written by Prabhupada. Um,
Mm.
and and they would give out these books, and then they would give you a bag of Gita, which I would read and then revisit years later. But it was that initial kind of meeting with them that I think was really important. And then for me as well, then seeing, I was then interested in the travellers' culture and Stonehenge, and I know they always turn up at Glastonbury, and it's a great story of a traveller friend of mine who went to Glastonbury, and some of the travellers were winding up some of the Krishna devotees. They got beaten up by the devotees, and then
Uh-huh.
then they kind of like they saw them as some kind of sort of Shaolin type monks. I mean, this was back in the 90s or the 80s. So
Mm.
it's a great story. So how old were you when you first came in contact with a devotee then?
Uh, I think 16. I think
Right,
like
okay.
like I turned 16 when like June 1989, and that's exactly when that Maximum Rock and Roll came out.
Yeah.
So that kind of coincided pretty much. Turning 16, it was like, yeah, I would say it was probably one of the best times of my life, being 16. Like, I just didn't seem to have any worries. And like I was between sort of school and college, and, had that amount of time. And I think I had a part-time job. Like one day it's stacking some shelves. And so, yeah, it was just kind of magical time, really. It seemed to last longer than it did. But yeah, like the devotee that I saw in the street, it was a really wet day. I was always just looking around at society, thinking like, yeah, what is this all about? It just seems so unfair. I used to see a table in Manchester, and like, I always wanted to join them, but I didn't really. But they were sort of like animal rights type of table, with like pamphlets and posters and stuff like that. And I'd see that, and then, yeah, I just turned vegetarian. I was like, yeah, this is amazing how they're out there just sort of showing that. And I didn't end up like really becoming an activist in that way, or but maybe in other ways. But anyway, like just looking around, like generally, like UK northern sort of weather, kind of quite grim, whatever time of year that was. It was. I just remember that day being cold and grey and drizzly, and then I was always thinking like, oh, like there's even people who haven't even got a home on the street. So I was like, right, I'm going to I drew some money out the bank. I think I drew £10 out the bank, which is probably quite a lot at the time.
Yeah.
For me at that age and at that time, now it's probably 3 or 4 times the value or whatever. So I think I drew that out, and then I got it changed up. I seem to remember I had like 5 £2 coins. So I was going to find 5 homeless people, give them £2 each. And I was walking around, and it was uncanny that day. There just didn't seem to be any. So that's when I, talking earlier, I met that devotee, and he said, "You're not the body." So one of those £2 coins went to him, and that seemed like a lot to me, because if he's have you got that pamphlet, The Reservoir of Pleasure? It's just a pamphlet,
Yeah.
it's but I understand it's a donation, but I don't know, he sort of insisted on £2, but it was okay. I had that was the first devotee I'd had an interaction with, apart from seeing quite often, like we'd see the Harinam, we'd see the chanting party because we'd always go into Manchester from like age 14 and 15. We'd get the train in every Saturday practically because Buxton there wasn't much to do. Like so, Manchester we go. And one time we got robbed, I think, in the. Do you remember? Is it what's the underground market? It's like the Arndale, and then you got the. Have you been to the underground market? It's sort of still there, some of it, but some of it's not.
Oh,
But
yeah,
it's pretty
I know.
sketchy.
Yeah, what's it called? I know. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, but we'd go there and there'd be all sorts of stores and stuff like that. And yeah, it was basically in the middle of the street there that this devotee was standing. And then another time there was a devotee. I think it was slightly later. I think I'd read that pamphlet maybe a couple of times, and there was another devotee, and he was standing there. And I think he kind of had his beads out, like not in the bag, but sort of the string of beads, like the japa mala. And then I went up to him, and I don't know if he was like giving books out. I didn't get anything off him. But I started talking to him, and I said like I've been reading a bit about this, and like I said, how does it feel to to do what you do, like this chanting on the beads? And again he had a funny answer. He said, oh, it feels very nice actually. But he said, oh, but that's not the point. And then he went on to this kind of. I understand now the esoteric point is like we're not doing it for our own pleasure. Like we're serving, like we're sort of giving pleasure to Krishna, and then we're also receiving, a bit like water the root of the tree, and and the whole tree gets nourished. But for me, if he just said to me, "Oh, it feels very nice. This is the highest pleasure," like that, I just would have done it immediately. But he sort of lost me on some other point, and I don't know. It
Okay.
just didn't seem to be very welcoming and warm and friendly. So apparently, I think those devotees weren't involved with the temple there. I think they were, because there's been lots of splinter groups and all things like that. And for better or worse, I think someone told me later that that they would have been the kind of splinter group. And
Right.
yeah, I don't know. In a way, they didn't convince me so well. Actually, it was my friend Jack that really convinced me. I don't know if he really taught much philosophy, but I think he just walked the talk. Just being like
Okay.
a straight edge kind of guy. He, I think he really aspired us to be straight edge. It would have been Youth of Today, Minor Threat, and all that. And
Yeah.
also, we weren't really doing that. Like, I think when we were 13, the only thing we dabbled in was like my friend's mum used to brew some wine in a shed. And she basically, we just used to grab it, and it was disgusting. It was like spinach wine and things like that. And like, it was the most foul. Can you
Yeah.
imagine? But we were like, oh, let's try this out. And, it didn't take much. You have a few sips each, and it almost vomit probably straight away. And after a few sips of that, we'd get quite drunk, and we'd go on a rampage, around the small town of Buxton, which is kind of quite picturesque.
Yeah.
And I remember sort of seemingly having like the time of my life, but of course, that was just complete, like just oblivion. And all we did was just go around. I remember going like went to like the cricket ground. I think we smashed the window of the shed,
Mhm.
and then we were damaging cars. Someone would damage a mirror. Someone would damage like the aerial. Someone would scratch the car. And like in that state, we were like, wow, this is just so much fun. But you look back at it now, and it's just like it's horrendous. You're just in this
Yeah.
state, and you're just creating destruction. You're just creating karma in a way. Like, but it didn't last that long because I think what it was is like the come down, the kind of the hangover and the vomiting or whatever like that. And so anyway, it wasn't really for me, and like most people didn't really after that. We were more into high energy, like skateboarding around.
Yeah.
The only issue with that was the injuries that you received. But yeah, we were more into just loud music. We'd often like probably have a tape player and take that down, and we skating like car park curbs and things like that, and just sort of grinding up the curbs. And we ever a skateboarder?
No, no, not at
No.
all.
Oh
No.
well, like a rebel then, because yeah, and then it sort of went hand in hand. But even in metal days, actually, we started skating like when we are into metal, because like metal, you could get like a Metallica board, and that it sort of very much went hand in
Yeah.
hand, and then it kind of it crossed over into skateboarding and sort of punk, and then the values that you had, but yeah, like vegetarian, and then later veganism. I think within about a year, I'd sort of turned vegan. I just sort of went the whole hog. I started reading. I was like vegetarian. Then I learned about at school. My friend Mark, he was like a year older than me, and like he was kind of a cool guy. I looked up to him, And then I was buying like cheese rolls, and he was like, "Oh, cheese has got rennet in it." So I was like, "Oh,
Oh
so I'll have
yeah.
to give that up." And then it was like, "Oh, eggs, like most eggs are battery eggs." So because I used to like Mars bars, and I was like, "Oh, damn, it's got eggs in it. I'll renounce those." And like so bit by bit, I like renounce eggs, and then dairy itself, and it was largely his influence. Oh no, I think I turned vegan slightly before him. He got me on the path of sort of giving things up. I kind of like the idea of like, oh no, it's something I could do. And then I turned vegan. We started Stockport College, like BTEC, like
Mm.
diploma in like art and design. And so that's when I met him. And actually, I think the first day I wore the Youth of Today shirt, and I had you cut the sleeves off, and I wore that with a jump on the top of a jumper. And I saw him, and I kind of thought, he's a funny punk guy. Actually, he kind of had a mullet. He had a bit of hair at the front, bald in the middle,
Yeah.
blonde at the back. So he was kind of like a punk hippie kind of guy.
Yeah.
But I didn't really talk to him. I was a bit shy, whatever. But the next day, I had the Napalm Death shirt on. Actually, I had the one with SOB, and then I had another Napalm Death shirt. So when I had that on, he started talking to me. I think he said he was at the gig too. So anyway, we connected straight away with that, and like he also bolstered the fact, that because everyone else at school, I turned vegetarian. I was actually at school still, and then
Okay.
some of my friends, there's a friend actually. He's one of my best friends now, but at the time, he ripped the piss out of me. He was like, "Oh, you're a vegetarian. You're a wimp," and all that, and like. And he almost tried to disown me. He gave me a lot of shit at the time. And like now, he's like one of my best friends. So
Right. Yeah.
sometimes, but yeah, it was sort of being at college and then carrying on listening to punk, and yeah, he was straight. Well, he called it teetotal. He was like, "Oh, you're not straight edge." Like he's like, "Oh, that's like American." Like he's like, "Oh, Americanism." And I was like, "There's nothing wrong with like obviously not everything American is amazing." That was his sort of thing. I was
Right.
like,
Yeah.
"No, there are
Seeing
some
it as some
things."
sort of cult, straight
Yeah,
edges. Yeah.
yeah, it wasn't like we were like into Disneyland or like. Oh, I mean, when I was much younger, I was always like, "Oh yeah, America, it must be like a paradise or Disneyland." But
Yeah. Yeah.
I just accepted that the bands from anywhere were good, and there was some good American bands, and yeah, he was a bit against that anyway at first. It was a bit funny, but yeah,
So
I don't know. Yeah, we hung out together, and we were like vegan, and like and he was straight edge, but he just didn't really like even with us, we labeled ourselves a bit. We used to put X's up, and actually there was some pretty
yeah.
good gigs in Buxton, and actually some of the gigs were at Burbage Institute, which was my preschool. So I was there before school, and it ended up like having these bands coming out. There was one from Durham, I think, called No Way Out,
All
and
right. Yeah.
all these bands used to come down. We went up to Durham once, like the local band Fallen Pieces. Like they played up there, and then bands came down. Then I ended up forming a band called Third Rate, which is very propaganda esque, and yeah, the
Okay.
drummer was like vegan. Yeah, and pretty much sort of similar kind of thing. But yeah, the sound was kind of like more, it was a very kind of propaganda influenced sort of thing, kind of fast. And sometimes we just stop and then suddenly have a jazz breakdown and things like that.
Mm.
And so yeah, I started doing that in Manchester. But yeah, even going back to the Buxton scene, there was like a lot of bands coming out of town, and it's uncanny when you think about it. Buxton's such a small place, and
Yeah.
to have gigs. And then there was that pub called the Ashwood, and there was a lot of gigs there. Like we played our first gig there, and it had a really good response. You had like a full kind of crowd of people. Some people are into the scene, or just like a lot of local people, not much going in Buxton. People were like, oh, okay, there's a gig on, we'll check it out. And some of our parents would have been there and that kind of thing. And yeah, and we were we were talking about vegetarian. And actually, that drummer side, he admitted to me like he really understood the idea, but he was like, I just love like a steak, like a bloody juicy steak. But hanging out with me, he just straight away I think he became like almost vegan overnight. He just realised that he liked it, but he just knew it was inherently wrong, and so
Yeah.
we completely stopped like that. Yeah. But we only had the
So
bang on for years because I'd already like booked my round the world ticket, and that sort of brings us up to like the Australian sort of scene.
right. So what I've heard a lot about, and it's really interesting, is kind of the diet, really, and the vegetarianism. So what you are initiated. Can you talk a little bit about when you got initiated and
Mm,
that journey up to being initiated? In other words, I suppose um, where did the Krishna consciousness come into this, and
mm.
where did you move from being a vegetarian, stroke vegan, and punk into a Krishna devotee, so to speak? How did
Yeah,
that
yeah.
journey start to evolve?
Yeah, we'll talk about that. It's a long story. I'll try and condense it a bit. But yeah, I mean, it's really interesting, I think, as well. I always find it interesting how people, because, that transition is quite a lot harder in some ways. Just being sort
Yeah.
of straight and vegetarian, things like that, it's not so difficult or it's not so foreign seeming. So when I came over to Australia, it was amazing at first. Like it was the summer and it was sort of like living in Bondi, and I didn't really had to work much, I had some savings, and it was just like down the beach a lot and thinking, oh, this is great. But everything sort of passes, and so like the weather started to you know, get a bit worse. And then I remember one particular day, and it was just like I was like, oh my god, this is just like UK, and it's grey and drizzly. I've got to go and do my laundry, and at that point, I'd read in Prabhupada's books, but one line really stood out. He said, "Why have I been put into this miserable condition of life, material life?" And that really rung true. Like I forget about it, but then on a really low sort of point of a day, that would sort of ring to me again, and it would remind me. And so can't quite remember the timeline, but I was living in Bondi Junction, and there was a lot of books. There's one devotee here called Rupa Raghunath, and he sold like a set of books to that library, and I ended up like getting a lot of the books in the library, and also the tape. I'd never heard George Harrison's album, All Things Must Pass, with My Sweet Lord on. So that
Yeah.
tape was there, and that kind of blew me away. The fact that was on there, and it kind of coincided with reading about the Beatles' influence and all that. But I think just prior to that, I was skating around in Bondi Junction in the mall. There's the beach side, which is right down the road. But then there's kind of up the road, sort of like a couple of miles, is the suburb, with a shopping sort of centre. So I was going like through the pedestrianised area, skating through, and a devotee stopped me. And I don't know who he is. I've never seen him or heard him since, but he was really friendly compared to the ones I'd met before. He wasn't Indian. I think he was sort of Indonesian or sort of Asian. But I don't know, he seemed really friendly to me. And he had the stickers. Um, he had the Jagannath sticker, which is on the Shelter album. So I recognised it from there. Oh, just backtrack slightly. We saw Shelter, me and my friend Nathan. We drove to Birmingham from Manchester
Okay.
and saw Shelter on that Mantra tour. Actually, Mantra album hadn't come out, or we hadn't got a copy of it. You would have the early two albums, but I used to look at the gig guide in the only way of looking at gig was it like NME or
Yeah.
Melody?
Melody
Remember
Maker.
that?
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
yeah, one day I used to look in there and see what's going on, and one day I read Shelter, and I was like totally taken aback, and I was like, oh no, that must be a different Shelter. Sometimes you've done that, you see a band of the same name, it's different, but I was like, whoa, I absolutely have to see that. So Jack missed out, but Nathan was kind of quite keen, so I convinced him to drive from Manchester, and so that was epic. Like we hadn't actually heard the Mantra album, but it was that tour, and it was all those songs, all the previous ones, and again, there was a massive build up. They had the
Mm.
chanting going in the background. I think
Yeah.
purposely standing there for 15, 20 minutes or whatever, while they're doing things. And, they had some kind of thing chanting and gets you sort of. And so there was a real intrigue about it. And that was just really epic as well, that gig, and there would have been a table there, sort of merch and books or whatever like that. But yeah, that was just that really life changing. So
Okay.
actually, when Manchester came out, I'd say that was the pinnacle of everything. Like that album, because some of the other albums have hit and miss, but Mantra for me was like actually sometimes I used to skip the first song because it was slightly metalish, but now I
Yeah.
really like. But I jumped straight to because "Civilized Man" I think is my favorite song ever. So I used to often start the album with "Civilized Man," and then
Yeah.
later on I can realise that the entire album, from start to finish, musically, lyrically, everything, it was just an epiphany. And there was the paragraph which is on the lyric sheet, where he says that he says we're all spirit souls, and he says like a moth flies into the flame just to meet its destruction. chasing transient sense gratification, leaving us empty, frustrated, sad. And like, I still remember like verbatim that. And I showed it my drummer. I thought he was going to be really inspired like me. And he just brushed it off. For him, he just didn't get like the spiritual kind of aspect. So I kind of realized at that point that not everybody, it's a bit like a diamond. Like, you're not always going to get like every customer. But for me, that was like, right, I'd already sort of decided that's consolidated. I was just like, right, this is incredible, what's going on. And something I could relate to. I couldn't quite relate to just direct devotees, And so sometimes
that's interesting. Yeah,
like, it was a bit, it's like you need a transition. So, the music was what I recognized, but then the philosophy came through the music and it bridged the gap. It's like two worlds in some ways, isn't it? Like when you're a devotee, sometimes you're sort of straddling two worlds, and it's not always easy. Sometimes it's easier to be just in the temple. It's kind of hard as well. But in the long run, you've got to straddle two worlds. So yeah, it bridged that gap. So
and what was it? What was it about that? I've interviewed other people, and I know Raj Kishore notes the kind of the whole system of the Vedas and the Bhagavatam and the Gita, that not only was there a kind of a dietary requirement, not only was there the four principles, but actually underpinning this was this whole kind of philosophy and a kind of an ancient philosophy that which underpinned this. And was that really was that something that grabbed you as well? That there were so many answers here, and you talk about we're not the body, which is an epiphany in itself. What was it that whole system building that you find in books like the Bhagavatam and others that really pulled you towards this philosophy?
Yeah, I think it definitely was. Like I always had a respect for, any other kind of philosophy or idea. The idea of like, ancient civilizations being like, a lot wiser in many ways than what we've got now. I never quite bought the idea that we're now at the sort of pinnacle of civilization. In some ways we seem to be, in terms of technology, but in some ways we're kind of really backward. So like the Vedic had a kind of a technology, but it was a much more of a subtle nature. For example, you could travel, in a certain way. Now we just think of travel as being like very mechanical, sort of flying through, with a rocket ship or like that. But I don't know. Anyway, like I think the idea of this sort of ancient culture civilization, it seemed really it seemed very wise. It seemed to have the answers that we're really lacking in modern society. And so it wasn't that Prabhupada was against like modern civilization, and he gave a really nice analogy that he said that like the West is sort of a bit blind spiritually, but India's like kind of lame. It's a bit kind of it's a bit chaotic. Whereas things that tend to be a bit more organized. So he'd say like if you put the blind man on the lame man's shoulders, no, the other way around, isn't it? You put the lame man on the blind man's
on the
shoulders. Yeah. Otherwise, a disaster. But yeah. So the blind man can walk, but then the lame man has the vision. So I thought that was a brilliant analogy. So he was all for using anything that you could be utilized, almost everything with a few exceptions can be used to further the knowledge. So that in itself I think was quite revolutionary because it sort of meant that you didn't necessarily have to give everything up. Actually, I'll backtrack slightly more. There was one guy, he became a devotee. His name was Mick, and actually Jack was friends with him. And he worked in Eastern Bloc. So I knew him. He was selling me the records. He would recommend, he'd be like, oh, check this out, check this out. And so he was kind of like my music guru. And I heard later he became a devotee and never saw him again. So I had the idea that like if you became a devotee, that was it. Like you were done with everything, like your friends, family, you were just done with it. It's either one or the other. And that was just my idea. Of course, sometimes in the beginning, you may do that. You sort of dedicate yourself as like a monk, but later on you realise that no, you don't have to give everything up. It's just about a change of consciousness. So anyway, when he became a devotee and he disappeared, it sort of put me off. I was like, well, I don't think I'm ready for that. And there was another devotee. Actually, I need to backtrack again. This is the first devotee I think we met. It's coming back to me now. This is a really funny story. Me and my friend Ev, who's like one of my oldest friends, even from like preschool. I've known him. He was a year older than me, and we were just like brothers. And I'm still friends with him now. He became a crackhead, and now he's sort of like out of that. But we were metalheads. We would have been, I think, 14. These times we went to Manchester, in front of Eastern Bloc, there always used to be this guy, and I'd say there's something about him, but I couldn't put my finger on it. But one day he stopped us. He took some headphones and like what you've got on, and I think he put them on Ed first, and then onto me, and like it was bhajans. It was like Indian sort of like sort of chanting. But for me, it was really alien. And I was into metal and stuff. I just got into sort of metal maybe and rock or whatever. But it wasn't my thing. But then he sort of asked, he gave us like a tape each and just sort of asked. So I was like, okay, we'll buy it. Obviously it's he's doing something. It's more like a donation. So we got it, and the tape was called Goranga Hey. And like meant nothing to me at the time. I didn't know. And my friend actually said he liked it. And actually, I saw him a year ago, and he said he still had it. I forgot to find it, but he said he sometimes listens to it still. And for me, it did nothing for me. I just didn't relate. But I kept seeing posters up after that around Manchester and on flyovers. Call out Garanga and be happy. Yeah. You may have seen those. I'll show you later. I'll send you like a link, of something I did related to that, because that became a massive campaign. And so I related it. I remember seeing it at one point, and I just thought, that's the tape I bought. That's the demo tape of the band, this Goranga band, and they're still chipping away. A couple of years later, I didn't realise what it was. And then what happened is when I came to Australia, I met that devotee. He just gave me an invitation, I think, and a sticker, the Jagannath sticker, for my skateboard. But it was the first time I'd gone to the temple. So when I came to the temple, I went in the temple shop, and I think it was the first day there, or maybe the second time I'd gone. But I'd read some of Prabhupada's books, but I'd never heard that name Goranga. I knew Chaitanya. So, there's two names for the same personality. So I went in the shop and I saw the poster, and I was like, oh yeah, there's Chaitanya, sort of chanting and dancing. And then I went down, and then at the bottom of the poster, it said Sri Goranga. And I was stunned. I was like, oh my God, there was an epiphany again. Because, the Goranga tape was there, and then the call out of the Goranga on the walls. And I hadn't come along with that. That was like another angle. I'd come along, through shelter, through reading the books, and I hadn't come across Goranga. But it all connected the dots, and that was incredible for me to see that. And that's when I started chanting, because I think I'd been to the Sunday program. And so the first real devotees I'd met, the first time I went to the Sunday program, I heard the class, that was amazing. And then the chanting, at that point I really liked it. It was sort of everyone was dancing, and then the food. And I was trying to be vegan, but most of it would have been lacto vegetarian. But so I left like a lassie. I didn't drink the drink, which was obvious. But most of the meal I kind of had. I wasn't so rigid. I was sort of I could see they're doing something that is, in a way, this is kind of a higher kind of thing. Yeah. So. Yeah, and the whole thing blew me away. It blew me away so much that the whole program finished, and it must have been maybe 8:30 p.m. or something. And I was still looking around. I was still walking around the temple, looking at all the paintings. And then this Maltese devotee, he was a brahmachari. He was called Alf at the time. Later, he became Shamananda. And so he took me under his wing. And first thing he said to me, he just said, "It's fascinating, isn't it?" And I was like, "Yeah, it's totally." And he brought me in the room that I'm sitting in now. So, which is incredible. Okay. I didn't really plan to end up in this room, but this room, now it's sort of temple presence office. They're renovating it, but at the time, this room was kind of like a book. It was sort of a room to bring people in and sit down, and and it used to have a shelf of books. So he spent about an hour, and he was sort of in the punk scene as well. He had a band, I've forgotten the name, but it was kind of a bit sort of punky alternative. he had this band going, and he was a Christian, and I think he was a Christian,
Okay.
like he was kind of proper, like following Christian and maybe vegetarian, and he was doing his band doing that. And when he told me that whole story, I was like, I hung on every word he sort of said. And so every time I kind of came back to the temple, I'd look for him, and usually he'd be here. And yeah, like he was incredible. He started having like a lot of mental issues, and then he kind of disappeared. He struggled with it, and I've struggled with
Okay.
mental health. A lot of us struggle with things like that, and depression or addiction. But yeah, I think he had it so severely that yeah, never really saw him again. But look, I'm just so grateful that he's really the first devotee that I met that I just loved like everything about him. And then later, that's what really inspired me. Like some of these people in the street had been like, I hadn't quite related to them. They weren't being so friendly. But yeah, for him, he was just like so warm and friendly. So it was like coming just to hang out with friends. There was him and a few others. So, but when I first came to the temple, I had the invitation. It was pre like, internet and phones and all that. So I didn't have a map. I just had the address. And so I came to North Sydney Station, and then I didn't even really know go left or right. Well, I went left up the hill, and then I saw Miller Street, and the address was corner of Miller Street and Falcon Street. So I was like, okay, I'm in the right direction. Here's Miller Street, and I
Mm.
started going up Miller Street. Now it's quite a long walk. It's quite a hill. The walk to the temple is like 15, 20 minutes. So I'd gone about 10 minutes right to the top of the hill, and I was like looking around, and I was like, God, I don't know where I'm going. I don't know if I've gone the right way. And I got to this point of like this notice board where the community centre. And I started looking around for a map, and I can't remember if there's a map there or not, but there was a girl, and I think she first said to me, "Oh, do you know where such and such is?" And I said, "Oh, sorry, I'm lost too."
Mm.
I said, like, do you know where Falcon Street is? And she said no. And then she said, "Oh no, but oh, do you want to come for a drink with me in the pub?" And I was like, that never happened to me before. Like I was like, really shy, and that's what we understand now is like sort of Maya, the power of illusion. Being entangled in the world of sort of enjoyment. So it was like a test. Like it was kind of the first sort of test. I didn't really understand at the time, but I was so determined. What I did, I was trying to sort of like have both worlds, like have your cake and eat it. So
Yeah.
I said, no, I don't drink. I said, but I'm actually going to the Hare Krishna temple and they've got free food. I said, you're welcome to join me. As soon as I said that, she like just disappeared, like almost into a puff of smoke, and that was it. But I think I can't remember if she said or I sort of figured out that all I had to do was go like another few minutes, and you get to this park, and
Yeah.
then you get to the temple, and it's on the corner. It's on a very busy street where I'm sitting now, but and that was incredible as well. When I started watching that and I first saw it, I just had this feeling that like this is large in life. You have a feeling where something in your life is like this is like a really key moment in your life, like a milestone. We have those points. So,
Yeah.
talking about sort of the punk and the vegetarianism, like the spirituality. So, just walking up to that thing, I was like, right, I've got a feeling this is going to play a significant part of my life, and of course it has. I've kind of dipped in and out because sometimes everything changes. The scene sort of goes in and out of phases, and temples go in and out of phases.
Yeah. Yeah.
So sometimes it ends up like rather than being a lot of Western people like me. One time, the only time I think, oh, maybe a couple of times. Sometime a couple of girls came. I think I was a brahmachari, and like some girls had come from Sweden, and they were sort of like vegan, straight edge type of thing when they came to the temple. And then another guy had come from local area, Hornsby, and he was a youngish guy, and he had a punk band, and he came one day, and I talked to him, and I was like, oh yeah, this is what it's about, local people
Yeah.
that I relate to. But yeah, that I don't know, that sort of that had its day, especially in Australia. There was very people weren't really into straight edge and stuff here. It's all about beer and barbecues and beaches and stuff like that. But yeah,
And so,
that's what really inspired me.
can we haven't got long left. We've only got about 10 minutes
Mm,
left. It's been
mm,
absolutely fascinating. And
mm,
um, I think something that really fascinates me is people's stories and
mm,
the anecdotal sense of those stories and what you're saying. And I really like those. Hearing about you approaching the temple and thinking, wow, these are kind of epiphanies, these kind of
Mm.
key moments. Could you just give us over when did you begin, excuse me, the Krishnacore.com website?
Yeah, well, I was in the temple, yeah, from what was it, 1980, no, 1998. And so I lived 5 years as a brahmachari, and just early on, like that's when web started coming. So the temple president said, "Oh, that's great that you know those skills, and we've got a computer." And I started doing like the design, the newsletter, and then the website. He was like, "Oh, I'd like to have a website for the temple." So I started doing that. Like that was iskon.com.au. So they've still got that domain name. So yeah, I built the first website for Sydney Temple, and maintained that, and a newsletter. That was one of
Okay.
my main services. And then yeah, and then probably maybe 2 3 years later, I decided to sort of kind of go back to my roots a little bit. It kind of inspired me to realize that my roots had come from the kind of punk thing and bridged over into Krishna consciousness. So I thought, oh, this would be a good thing. There doesn't seem to be much. There was bands out there. There's a lot of zines. There was kind of quite a lot, more than I thought when I started digging. But there was nothing really on the web so much. So yeah, I just basically on my own steam. I had a friend that used to support us with donations. And I hit him up. I said, I'm going to make this website, and he was like, yeah, just whatever you need. And so he paid, I think, for the domain and the hosting, and I basically built it. And
Right.
that time Flash was quite big, so now Flash has been sort of killed by Apple or whatever. But
Yeah.
it was really
Yeah.
good, because you could have the animation and the music. So, it was quite dynamic. The Temple website had a lot of Flash. And then this one had quite a lot of Flash, which often doesn't work now. But yeah, I basically started doing that. And to research it, I was using the web, because I didn't have much of the resources. Some things maybe in the temple, actually, like they had the Back to God in it, which had Raj Kishore interview, and it's got like I think it's like shelters on the cover, or so
Yeah.
some of the Back
Okay.
to God magazines are quite relevant, and so Raj Kishore, like Vic at the time, he had that column, and he had that quite controversial sort of thing going on. And so basically, I was scanning in all that and like digitizing it, putting it on there, and writing some things myself. Getting whatever music I could, some of it on the web, and then just trying to dig around, and contact. And what I realized is that there's a lot more than I thought. Like I'd missed out on like significant stuff, like calls for alarm. Like I knew about calls for alarm. I probably
Yeah.
heard that
But
first EP, but I had no idea. Like even on that first EP, there's one song which is apparently it was inspired. And then later on, their albums, quite directly, very much like Shelter in a lot of ways. So, I managed to dig them out. Actually, I just stumbled upon those in a shop here one day. And like my wife at the time when I was married was shopping, and I just suddenly just disappeared to another suburb. And I found this secondhand CD record shop. Yeah, and they had like two or three of these calls for alarm. And I was like, wow, that was meant to be. And like I grabbed them, and yeah, the more I dug, the more I realized there was so much stuff,
yeah.
I'd missed out on as being younger. And, I started to relish, finding all this other stuff. And then, yeah, people started contacting me, via email. So I can show people like this was in the Philippines, I noticed there's a massive thing. And so there was this zine, which is called Why Sit Down, it's basically do something. So he'd interviewed me. I think it was Philip. Oh, no, Alex. There was Alex and Philip, two brothers, and they
Okay.
both became like initiate devotees of the Rhine Mirage. They sort of interviewed me in there the first thing, and then I wrote for this scene. This guy in Greece had this scene, Keep It Real.
Right. Yeah.
I wrote an article, so I called it Krishna Consciousness, the old school straight edge. So
Yeah.
I was kind of relating in a way, in a sort of joking way that there's nothing new, you know. I mean, not that anyone in straight edge probably claimed it was new. It was just a new name for something, So like the requisite principles that we follow, the four sort of things. But it kind of goes beyond that, It's like no intoxication, which just sort of covers the straight edge, and then there's no meat eating, and then there's no gambling, and then but the big one is like no illicit sex. I mean that was sort of there also in straight edge, wasn't it? Like even Minor Threat, he was sort of like don't drink, don't smoke, don't fuck,
Yeah.
at least I think. But it
Exactly.
wasn't like he always said. It wasn't really a directive. It was more like no, this is just what I do. It's just better for me. But I don't know. In any way, it just paralleled quite a lot. I found so at that time. I think a lot of straight edge people sort of made the transition because they realized the power line, and so it made it easy. If you're already following a lot of those things, all you've really got to
Yeah,
do is add the chant and the meditation.
and
So
it's there.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
I mean, the website itself, I've got here. Um, you sent me, and what I'll do is I'll put the link in YouTube. Um, is
Mm,
the Wayback Machine. I mean, the
mm,
website is pretty damn good. I mean, you're covering stuff like the history of Krishnacore, philosophy. There were some articles in there. Um, Also some pictures. I know that the pictures and the audio and the video don't work because of it being archived, which is a real shame.
mm,
But this was
mm.
the first time that anyone had kind of started to collate these ideas around Krishna core and to
Yeah.
really kind of uh, just say, yes, this is what was going on in the 1990s. And I know that
Mm,
in the history, for instance, you do know the influence from the Cro-Mags and you say, look, actually,
mm,
they weren't Krishna core as such. They were influenced by the Hare
mm.
Krishna movement, but it was
Yeah.
really the it was really Capo and Raj Kishore and those guys and
Mm,
Kramer as well that really
mm,
and Baby Go Power that really
mm,
kind of established this kind of genre. And I really
mm.
like that. I mean, it's a great history of the theme.
Yeah. Actually, I like how you mentioned the Cro-Mags because sadly I forgot to mention them. For me, the Cro-Mags, actually, we had a skate video, like a local skate video we made, and we had the Cro-Mags Hard Times as the
Oh
soundtrack.
yeah,
I always found the Cro-Mags for me were a little bit pretty heavy and like slightly metal tinged. Like I'd sort of moved on from metal more to a bit more melodic stuff. I didn't mind it, but they weren't massively on my list. But to be honest, I remember seeing the second album. Well, even the first album, The Age of Quarrel. I think I remember seeing that cover. But the second album, which is Best Wishes, which is a great title, and it's got Nasimadave, like the half man, half lion avatar. I remember to this day seeing that like an Eastern Bloc record. I didn't buy it, but I remember seeing that, and I was like, whoa, that image is incredible. I was like, I've always had this thing with Nasima Dave, and that was the first time I'd seen it. I
right,
never actually
yeah,
bought the album. I mean, I don't know why I didn't buy it. I think it was just like a funds maybe, but I remember seeing it. And the funny thing is, in my memory, I seem to remember that being the full cover. But actually, when you see the album, it's like a small portion of the cover.
yeah, yeah,
But I don't know. It must have just had an impact on me. And in my memory, I seem to remember that image filling the whole cover. But I don't think that's actually how it is. Sometimes your mind, doesn't remember things as they actually were. But I never forgot that. And that was another thing. Like when I started, like doing the site and discovering these bands like Calls for Alarm and lots of others. Yeah, it was also a real. Oh yeah, the Cro-Mags. I sort of knew they had maybe slight connection, but at that point it became obvious that they were almost one of the pioneers, weren't they? Oh, there was
yeah.
one band before that, weren't there? What's the band that I think
There,
influenced them?
there was
Uh,
the Foods and also Fed Up as well.
I was that in
Um,
before that. Yeah, God,
Antidote, yeah. Oh, I don't
Antidote.
know.
That's what I was thinking.
Yeah,
Antidote. Like they weren't sort of Krishnacore per se, but Antidote had that image again, which is like an ISKCON painting
that's
of
right.
the
On the
of
front
the,
of
the
the
cow
single,
being
yeah,
slaughtered. And again, that's an incredible image, isn't it?
yeah,
Antidote.
yeah,
Actually, one guy, I think when I was doing the site, sometimes it's a bit flat. That was another issue. Like these
yeah,
things we talk about in another time, even. But yeah, the backlash. But yeah, like one time I think he wrote to me. I think it was the singer or the drummer, and he was sort of like, "Oh, don't lump us in like with Krishnacore, like we weren't exactly." And but my idea was like, whatever was related, not everything was exactly, like that. There's different spectrums, like like Shelter was formed specifically, to just spread Christian consciousness, wasn't it? And
yeah,
and bands
yeah,
like that, but some bands just had like an influence, and a tinge or whatever. So it's like a spectrum. But I like how
yeah.
108 came out. Obviously, Raj Kishore left Shelter and then did 108. And so one of my friends, Andy Bryant, he was like a straight edge guy. He had a band. He had a really influential band in the UK. You must have. Oh, it'll come to me in a minute. Their name. Oh, Imbalance. You ever heard
Oh yeah,
Imbalance?
yeah. I have.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I was really
yeah,
good friends with him. He would call me up, and he'd call me up, and he'd do what I'm doing now. He would dominate the conversation, and after an hour, he would say, "Oh, I'm just talking at you," and he feel really bad. I'm just like, "No, I'm listening to what you're saying." And he was like really influential. He was kind of really moral sort of person, and that band had a really good life for a UK band. So he sent me the tape of 108, like, you know, he recorded, might have been a couple of the albums. And anyway, when it came in, like the post, I think, my friend Jack ended up living with me. Because he, you know, he was living in Manchester, and he was living like the gangland. He had to escape, you know, like gunshots and like robberies and stuff
Yeah,
like that.
that it was going on
First he
in
was on
that. So, yeah.
our couch. He wouldn't want to go back to late. Then he moved in the conservatory, which was tiny. And then the landlady said, "Someone's living in the conservatory." We kind of had to move. So then four of us moved to another house. So it was me, Mark, Nathan, and Jack. So I mentioned all these people. You can imagine that it was a pretty cool share
Yes,
house.
yeah, yeah.
So when the tape came, Jack was like, "Oh, wow, 108, I'll have to check that out." I never got to hear it because he just got it. And I don't know, for some reason, sooner or later, I ended up back in Buxton and then like overseas. But to be honest, like 108 for me, it took quite a while to get over. Again, like, you know, very metal influenced.
Yeah,
Sometimes
yeah,
metal for me had a bit of a jar and thing. I was sort of like, I'm done with metal. Like, I've had my metal. Now I can get it. Like, I really get the idea of what he did, because he would criticize like Shelter for being like a little formulaic.
yeah,
Um,
yeah.
there's another debater I used to speak to, and I think Raganath gets him to like, or he got him to do the riffs. Forgotten his name. I think he
Yeah.
disappeared. He got a bit disgruntled, but we'll probably run out of time soon. But
Yeah,
yeah, the
yeah. I
idea
think
was
I
that
think we
Shelter
have.
were,
Yeah,
you could say a little formulaic in a way, but you know, 108 were very experimental and also very like what they call like Rasika, or sort of, you know, the
yeah,
mood of devotion was coming. You know, like it was
yeah.
songs of separation, and it was almost more for people who were already on the path. And I see Shelter as being like, you know, more of an introduction. And so, you
Okay,
know, I
yeah,
really understand
yeah.
both bands. And
And I kind of think that as well. Really, regards, 108 and Shelter, etc. Um, so we've kind of come to the end. Um,
mm.
is there anything you'd like to talk about, to close, really? Is there anything you'd like to close on? Any kind of thoughts about where you're
Mm.
going for the future and where you are now?
Yeah, I can talk about personal stuff. I mean, I've been through quite a crisis. I mean, it's hard living in this world, especially when you're sort of juggling. Like, in one sense, like spirituality helps you deal with the world, but then in another sense, in some senses it can make it harder.
Yeah.
I always think of this lyric by there's a film called Oh Lucky Man. It's been one of my favourite films. Lindy Anderson. It's a British film, and the lyrics to that, he basically said a lot of things he says, but one is. If wisdom hangs around your neck like pearls instead of chains, you are a lucky man. So this film, Oh Lucky Man, and lines like that, like it's like wisdom can like really help you, you know, in this society. But in another sense, like a lot of people sort of choose like ignorance is bliss, or so it seems. Like in the end, it's
Yeah, yeah,
not.
we
You're
talked
going to
about
suffer
that last
more.
week,
But
didn't we? Yeah,
what? Yeah, the sort of the difficulty in some ways is like sort of opens your eyes to reality. Like the reality of the material world is like, you know, we're born, and you know, we grow, and there's inevitably there's disease, there's old age, and then there's death, and then, you know, according to the Vedas, there's rebirth. But you know, even if you don't say accept rebirth and the cycle of samsara, you know, which continues like perpetually until, you know, we're sort of liberated from it. So it's quite daunting in a lot of ways. Like you sort of think, oh God, like, you know, I don't even know if I would have started this journey if I hadn't known how
yeah,
difficult it is. You know, of course, often you can think, if you hadn't started, like, well, where would your life be? Like you would be worse off, but in somewhat kind of ignorance, you know, you might feel better. So yeah, like a lot of people, like sort of the wane, like the enthusiasm's there, and then it can wane. Sometimes people can disappear completely or come back. I've sort of come and gone, or sort of like wavered a little bit, and it's pretty common. It's very rare that you have someone that's completely steady, you know, and like, you know, so sometimes, like, you know, you know, a partnership doesn't work out, or a marriage,
yeah,
or
yeah,
you know, you try to be a celibate monk, you realize that, you know, because at first you think, oh yeah, you know, we're just going to chant and dance, you know, back to God in no time. But then, you know, you realize it's a long haul. So I would just suggest to anyone to, yeah, you know, bear in mind that, like, do something which is sustainable, you know, in the long haul, you know, try and sort of do what you can. You know, the principles are there to kind of as the bedrock. One of my, fall downs has been, sometimes lack of adherence to that. You know, most people struggle with something commonly, like, intoxication and, sort of immoral sex life. And so, it becomes, these things can disturb the mind. The whole idea is to, try and steady the mind and to focus it, up until the point of death. So it's very detrimental to, end up. And the thing is, like, these things are so rife in society, like in the Bhagavatam, basically Kali, there's sort of this influence of this dark age, needed somewhere to reside. So it's like, you're going to reside in intoxication, gambling, and sex and meat eating. And then he basically said, well, that's all that's really going on in this age of Kali. So I need somewhere else to reside. And then it's like, well, then you can reside in gold as well, So, the idea of wealth, also being, kind of quite distracting or bewildering, like too much, just chasing return wealth. So anyway, it's quite a difficult path. It's a difficult time we're in. And it's striking that balance. Like sometimes you can be like, I think I was artificially renounced, all connections to say like punk, sell all your records and all that, and then you end up like rebuying them. Like I probably ended up rebuying them, and like we didn't end up talking about reggae, but like I ended up like buying like a massive amount of reggae, and probably more than I need to listen to, but. Anyway, like it's called false renunciation. If you decide to just get rid of everything, and you still got a desire, then inevitably it comes back. So Prabhupada would say like you cleanse your heart by a gradual process and not too abruptly. So I mean everyone's different, and I think guidance is very crucial. And I think what you're doing is incredible because this is a kind of guidance. It's helped me a lot to share here, and I think what you and people like that are doing out there is a kind of guidance, because often maybe you can't get it in the person, but if you get it online, then it's really just as good, because it's the same idea. Prabhupada would say that, like the physical form's not so important, but hearing. So I mean, in my journey, I mean, I came across Indradyumna Swami. I found he was kind of quite, because some people don't understand this angle, but he was quite supportive of it. Like Shelter would be on his tour and Woodstock and things like that.
That's right.
Woodstock. So when you see that, you're like, I found it was very approachable and very, so, you gravitate towards people. You don't necessarily have to do formal initiation, but, it can be helpful. And the interesting thing was, I never told him this story. Maybe one day I'd love to, about the Garanga. But when I took initiation, he gave me a name. He says, you're a Sankirtan devotee. You will be Vijay Garanga Das. And I was like, whoa, there we go again. Like Garanga's come again. So these things like if you don't believe in, you either believe in coincidence or you believe in like some kind of divine thing, but the coincidence just seems like more implausible. How that kind of happened. For me, I don't really believe in those coincidences. Like everything's sort of meant to be. I mean, even the fact that I'm sitting here again, I wasn't sure where to do this interview. Like share house wasn't going to be very good, and I'm between my house until next week. So I'm sort of like right back into almost like where it started, where one of the first people that introduced me. So you see these things, and especially in difficult times, if you really, you really pray and you really try hard and focus and things like that, and trust, and so it's all about surrender, letting go, and that's what teaches us. Sometimes, like in the hardest times, you're really desperate and you let go. Like in the Bhagavatam, Draupadi's about to be disrobed. She's hanging on with one hand. And then eventually, she can't hold on to the sari. And, they're trying to disrobe her, the demoniac sort of side. And then she just throws both hands up and is like, hey, Govinda. And then, the sari miraculously like never ends. And, that's like a super high level of surrender. But, that's ultimately like the conclusion of the Gita, is surrender, abandoning and surrendering to me. And that's what we find difficult. It's like we're clinging on. We're trying to be ready. We're clinging on. Oh, my battery's low, but that's okay. Well, that's probably all I have to say. You can visit the website, which is, I might even try and revive it. Like, I don't know about rebuild it, but all the info's there. I think if you pulled it all together, you could get all the broken links going and we could run with it. Or for whatever, for better or worse, just share it out there again. And the Facebook page, I can't believe when we started that. We didn't talk about that much, but yeah, I kind of that just started when Facebook started. I just thought, yeah, let's start it in a Facebook group. And yeah, thanks to Madhu, if he hears this, thank you very much for he had Solidos de Liberación, which was like the
That's right.
Spanish.
Yeah.
So I just took a guess that means sounds of liberation. It didn't take too much, so
Oh,
yeah, I just tacked that on the end. So and yeah, we kind of both did that for a while, and then it's just run itself now, which is the beauty. Sometimes you can admin it a little bit, for spam or whatever. And like the website now, you can buy the domain Krishnacore.com, but it's like $2,500.
is it
Because
really?
they value it according to how many hits it's got. So it's pretty pricey now. Like at the time, it was probably $50 or something like, but now it's outpriced. Yeah, so it's a good thing in a way. Like, yeah,
Yeah, yeah. Okay,
yeah,
so with unfortunately we're going to have to draw it to a close.
yeah.
You said earlier about you dominating the conversation. I
Mm.
don't think you have at all. I think
Oh,
it's about kind of hearing your voice and about your
yeah,
experiences, and we've
yeah.
certainly heard a lot about that. In fact, there's
Mm,
more and more and more that we could talk about. We could probably be sitting here for another
mm,
hour or so just hearing about your experiences getting into Krishnacore.
mm,
What I'll do is when I upload this onto to YouTube, I will put the link um, in the kind of description so that's the way back, the web archive link for krishnacore.com so people can have a look at it.
mm.
But it's absolutely wonderful to speak with you, Mark, and it's great to have you on the podcast. And
Thank you so much.
and we wish you all the best for the future.
Yeah, thank you.
See you
Yeah.
later.
Next time I'll interview you. I think you'll have a lot of interesting stories also.
Yeah, okay. Let's
Yeah.
do that.
Yeah. We'll just flip it over. Yeah.
Yeah.
All right.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
See you soon.
Yeah. Thanks for your service. Great job.
Bye.